Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Patrick Johnson, the author of the 2020 book, Coming Out Queer Online, Identity, Affect, and the Digital Closet. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really,
Pleasure to be here.
really an interesting topic here. Tell us something about the genesis of this book. The title kind of tells us what it's going to be about, but how did it come about?
Yeah, so the book is kind of the culmination of about a three-year project that I worked on. It originated as my dissertation, which kind of evolved out of a numerous projects that I had been working on, really kind of looking at how is the LGBTQ community kind of forming communities online. Mm-hmm. So it started with a very small project that I did, kind of analyzing YouTube videos of this trend that I had seen on YouTube of people setting up candid cameras to capture their coming out experience to a family member. And that had kind of become a genre on its own. So I started looking into that, and then it kind of evolved into this much larger project.
If I could interrupt you there for a second,
Sure.
that's interesting to me. So, normally, historically, we've thought of genre as elegies and poetry and things like that. But as someone who studies social media, you're saying that they're actually genre that develop somewhat spontaneously and perpetuate themselves in this new media.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the reasons when I first started calling it a genre was as I started looking more and more, the similarities between the videos became very apparent.
Interesting.
Where they followed almost the exact same structure. And then what I think really solidified it was there became parodies of that content, where there was completely satirical ones that were mocking kind of the structure of how these videos are. And I think that was when I started kind of referring to it as a genre.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that, back in the days where print dominated everything, right? It would take years for a genre to develop, but this probably happened over a period of a couple of years.
Probably even less than that,
kind
of a few months, right?
Yeah.
It started with, the videos for the It Gets Better campaign, where people were just talking about their coming out experiences.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, people started setting up these candid cameras, and within a matter of months, people started kind of creating their own satires where they would have a fake hidden camera.
Yeah.
And then it would kind of go to the absurd level.
So, and at some point, somebody's going to publish a how-to video explaining how to make your coming out video, right?
You really don't even need to
According
publish
to
a how-to video. A lot of them actually contained their own how-tos.
Oh, did they? Yeah.
Including kind of not even just what they talked about was the same, but the structure was the same.
Yeah,
So there would be, somebody explaining why they were making it, and then you would see them setting up the camera, and they were explaining setting it up.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, so how has the coming out experience changed because of social media? And if you will, maybe I'm sure that's changed differently over the period of years here. Could you kind of walk us through that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the first things that I had to grapple with when I was looking at this project was kind of defining what coming out is. And I think it's a little more fluid now than maybe it was before, or actually maybe it's a little less fluid, in that people can post something online and kind of come out all at once. So the project not only looked at these online videos and certain LGBTQ spaces online, but I also interviewed 20 different people who had all had some experience with coming out online. Some of my participants were not fully out yet. Some of them had recently come out, and some of them had been out for years. And one of the things that kind of kept getting repeated was that there is no one coming out moment, right? So we often think, in a lot of media, it's discussed as, someone is either in or they're out, right? And you come out and you make this declaration. But really, that's not how it works out in reality, and that every time you meet somebody, you're kind of in this new process of coming out.
Plus, I suppose there's coming out to different groups, right? Coming out to your family versus coming out to your friends or your coworkers or going online.
Right. And so social media seems to, in some sense, have alleviated some of that, where maybe there's not a necessity to come out to each person individually, because you can just post.
Yeah.
Whether people posted an explicit coming out post or just were open about who their partner was at the time. So there was that, but then there was also, on the flip side, more anxiety and it becoming easier to be accidentally outed.
How do you mean?
Or just concern over, I guess,
By somebody else outing you.
somebody else outing you, or so one of the people that I spoke with,
Yeah.
he was not out to his family. He came from a very religious family, and he had created 2 separate Facebook profiles. One that he was friends with all of his family on, and then one that he had all of his friends from the gay community on. And then one day, his mom got a suggested friend notification from this other profile.
Oh.
Which was like his profile picture was him at one of the gay bars in Denver.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that led to him coming out to her.
How did that work for him?
It did not work out very well.
Some of these stories are really sad.
Yeah, that was
that
one
he
of
would
the-
have to hide that in the first place.
That was one of the sadder stories,
Yeah.
where it did not work out well. I think things are working out a little bit better now,
Yeah.
but at the
Yeah.
time it was not good.
So, other than that, you're exposing yourself to more people. Has it changed how we understand coming out in any significant way?
I wouldn't say it's changed anything in a significant way. One of the big conclusions that I make in the book, and one of the biggest, people often ask me what was my most surprising find.
Yeah.
And I always say that it's that I wasn't surprised by a whole lot.
Yeah.
So a large portion of the book is doing a historical analysis of newspaper articles, magazine articles dating back to the 1940s,
Yeah.
from LGBT-specific things. And a lot of the way that people were told to come out back then is being mirrored today, just on a larger scale.
So, I really never thought of people coming out having that deep of a history. Can you take us back a little? What was that like in the,
Sure. So
the 40s and 50s?
in the 1940s, there were it was still illegal to be, most states had anti-sodomy laws at the time.
Yeah.
It was before any kind of notion of LGBTQ rights. So there were these organizations that formed, most of them kind of at an umbrella term would be homophile organizations, the largest one being the Mattachine Society, that really was a Marxist, kind of left-leaning organizing group.
So it had a political edge to it, I'm sure.
It was very political.
Yeah.
At the same time, you had underground LGBT bars and clubs opening up, which kind of had like a terse relationship with them. So most people were not out at the time, except for close friends. And if they were, it was kind of like an open secret.
So there was a sort of a radical wing here, and then there was a more secretive wing, and the radical wing, I'm assuming, was upset about everybody else for not following their lead. Is that?
They were kind of both
the
at war with
tension?
each
Yeah,
other.
Yeah.
With one, and there's kind of been a long history of kind of disagreement within the LGBTQ community, as far as like what should LGBTQ rights look like, with the more radical movement really trying to argue for a radical change of how we view the structure of family, how we view those things, and then a more assimilationist, if you will, kind of side, arguing for trying to blend in.
I saw a movie in the late 60s, I think at this little art house theater in Old Town in Chicago, Piper's Alley, I believe. And it was called The Boys in the Band. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And the plot, it's a complex, varied kind of plot, but it kind of culminates with one of the characters coming out to someone who he had affection for. And it ends sort of tragically. How does that story fit into? I think it was a play before that, right? And it became a movie. I'm just curious. What part of the history of this does that reflect?
So there's a lot of history of LGBT films. Sadly, until recently, most of them have always ended in tragedy.
Yeah, well, that's right.
There's always been kind of a tragic story, either of somebody getting killed or getting sick, or at the very happiest, I guess, unrequited love. Even that trend continued recently, even up until Brokeback Mountain, which isn't as recent as I like to think that it was.
Right.
And that's something that's finally starting to change. But there were definitely films for the LGBTQ community, like more the art house films. But representation of LGBTQ characters kind of dates way back, even before that, into the 1920s. There was a version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where Mr. Hyde kind of took on a very effeminate gay persona as he was being a serial killer.
Right, they had to have something negative attached to it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you had another project, I think an earlier project, where you used Dear Abby and Ann Landers to track changing views about gay issues. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I think that's fascinating.
Sure. So one of the things that I love to do in all of my research, and I think it's important, is to look at the history and kind of look back to where we came from.
Yeah.
And so I really was interested in kind of how were people reacting to this newly visible LGBTQ community, you know, that kind of rocketed out of nowhere in 1969 with the Stonewall riots. And so I decided to trace kind of the two most popular advice columnists that are still writing. I mean, they're pen names, like they're pseudonyms.
Yeah.
It's not the same people.
Right.
But Ann Landers and Dear Abby, and really looking at what questions were they being asked, as well as how they were answering it to kind of see an evolution. And it was really fascinating seeing similar questions kind of arising and how people were interpreting different things that were theorized.
So the tracking the questions that were being asked was kind of a way of tracking where the world was on the issue at that point, but tracking Ann Landers and Dear Abby's responses was probably tracking changes that were coming, rather, because they're usually, as I understand about them, is they're usually like a source of how to adjust to things that are going on, that kind of stuff, right?
So it was interesting looking at the two of them because for the longest time, until the late 1970s, they were in direct opposition for how one should handle LGBTQ issues.
Really?
With Dear Abby being very supportive and kind of was always on the side of, well, you need to accept your kid, or you need to accept your friends, or whatever the situation would be. And Ann Landers, for the longest time, really arguing for conversion therapy.
Really?
And not accepting this immoral behavior, as she had called it. And it culminated into a moment in the mid to late 1970s where the two actually started talking to each other within the columns.
Oh, really?
Featuring, and there was a full page spread, pretty much,
And
of the two of
they
them.
were associated with different papers in New York.
Different papers, but they were both syndicated.
But it was syndicated, but they started out of New York, am I right? I don't know, it doesn't matter.
I don't know
Yeah, okay.
for sure. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah, all right, that's all right. Yeah, I'm just wondering if they reflected the environment that they were,
I would say
from,
that it seemed like they were probably reflecting the environment that they grew up in, or that they were living in at the time.
Yeah.
And one thing that Ann Landers really represents is kind of how science changed. So while Dear Abby was probably more reflective of her own personal circle, Ann Landers, her opinions changed very much with science, right? So up until 1973, homosexuality was a diagnosable mental illness, right? And so up until that happened, she was arguing for conversion therapy. And then once that starts changing, she starts arguing more for acceptance.
Right. So she needed some sort of philosophical underpinning, and when it changed, she changed with it, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does this tell us about changes in the culture then? Because I'm sure you were looking for more than just changes in their opinions, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was really interested in are kind of like what were the little moral panics. I called them mini moral panics throughout the article. And kind of when something changes, how do people react? And it's interesting because the way that the article or these questions were often written were not necessarily about themselves or about their own personal feelings, but they tended to use that to access kind of a much larger fear. And they tended to try to couch their own fears within, they were more concerned about humanity in some way. So
for instance, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the articles, the title of it, the first part of it is Gaydar Marriage and Rip-Roaring Homosexuals, which is all pulling straight from articles. and wording that was used within them. The concept of gaydar, which is still around today, was considered to be much more scientific. And so the idea is that gay people can recognize other gay people.
Okay.
And it was
Do you think that's true?
No.
No. I had a friend who was gay, and she was always, telling me, oh, this person, that person, and I thought it was odd. It almost seemed discriminatory to be judging people without, knowing anything about them.
I think to some extent, in that there is like a culture now.
Yeah. But she was usually right.
There's cultural norms and different things. So to some extent, sure.
Yeah.
But it's not based on any sort of biology or anything, which is the belief that it was in the 1970s.
Interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was this panic that if a gay person flirted with a woman's husband, she would write in kind of being afraid that her husband was secretly gay.
I see. Yeah.
Because why would he flirt with him if he wasn't gay, right? So it was interesting that, or another mother was concerned that her children would be viewed as gay if they wore flowered shirts, which in the 70s was still very popular, right?
Right.
And
we were all wearing flower shirts.
She blamed the homosexuals for ruining fashion for kids. Which I thought was
the hippies.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It was actually the hippies. Well, so one of the things that I was fascinated about this is that it grew out of some work you were doing as a graduate student, right? And I want you to kind of tell us about the genesis of that.
Sure. So it started as kind of a small project in a class that I was taking I have a graduate certificate in women and gender studies, and so I took a history of global sexuality class.
Yeah.
And for my project, I really wanted to kind of trace. I had to do some type of history. I had never really done a whole lot of history before then, right? Because my research is focused on social media, and it's very much in the present. And so I started thinking, what would an older form of social media be? And these advice columns kind of came to mind, which is something that, also came through in my dissertation, was that social media isn't necessarily new. It's just taken a new form. And I started looking on it, working on it, wrote the paper for the class, really liked the paper. I presented it at a few conferences, got some positive feedback, and then decided to partner with one of my faculty members who I had worked with to really revise it and get it out there.
Yeah, so I know your PhD is in journalism and mass communication from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And I was also in a communication department. And I know one of the problems you have when you're trying to track changes in the media or social changes through the media is you've got to focus on something that is somehow indicative of other things that are going on around it. And so when I saw your material on this article, I thought it was really a brilliant place to start, because it's a public forum, right? There are people writing letters, asking questions, and they're being selected for their relevance, I'm sure, by the editors of the newspaper and the columnists. And you could actually, and this issue's been coming up, I probably since they started writing these, right?
Yeah,
at least for a long time.
The earliest that I could find something published about this topic was 1967.
Yeah.
So a few years before Stonewall. I had originally started searching into the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's kind of indicative of the kinds of things you can do in college today that you couldn't do before. People think, well, if I'm going to college, I have to be an engineer, or I've got to be pre-med, or I'm going to study journalism. But you were actually able to study mass media and particularly focus on an issue of interest and work with that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great things about graduate school and just research in general is you can really kind of figure out what is of interest to you. And then what's important to me is how is that important to other things, right?
Yeah.
And then really kind of run with it. And there's so many different things that you can research from so many different angles.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about social media in general here, because you're actually more broadly focused than this one issue. I just wanted to start with the book, but what's your sense of where we're at with social media right now? Is it becoming more important or less important in our lives?
I think if 2020 has taught us anything, it's kind of how important social media has become. whether we are learning that because we're using it, or it has become more important because of, COVID-19. It really has become kind of like an extension of who we are. It's something I talk about in the book. There has often been a move to kind of separate social media from real interactions.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing with email. When people were first doing email, it was as if it didn't count. You didn't have to punctuate. You could use all caps if you wanted, and it's much more formal now, right? So are you saying that there's a similar transition going on with social media, that it's taking on more meaning and importance and substance?
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm old enough now that I was there when Facebook. I was part of one of the original groups to use Facebook, right? I was in college during phase 2 of the rollouts, when it was still only for colleges and only a select few colleges.
Because they were competing with MySpace, I think. Was that what it was called?
MySpace was a much bigger thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't use social media before
really
the end of college. I didn't even get on Facebook when it started.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have any friends who went to colleges that it was available at, right? But when Facebook first came out, I had tons of friends who were on it, and we only used it to kind of talk about what was going on that weekend on campus, right? It wasn't anything major. It was not a large part of our lives, right? It was a way to keep up with people that you had gone to high school with and to see kind of what parties were happening.
Yeah.
And I think certain social groups have really taken advantage of social media and kind of people being captivated and knowing that that's people's really only social outlet right now, to bring attention to their issues.
Yeah, because the interesting thing about social media is it's mass media, but it's two-way, whereas the old mass media, the television, the radio, was all one-way. So you can express yourself.
Yeah, it really gives, I'm not going to say it gives an equal voice to everyone, but it gives people the opportunity to have their voices amplified. And if they use it smartly, they've been able to build some very successful coalitions.
Well, if we can, we're getting close to the end. Let's finish talking about the evolving role of social media in politics.
Sure.
What's your take on that?
So there's 2 stances kind of on social media and politics, and one of those takes a very negative look at the role of social media in politics. And there's terms that are constantly thrown around like slacktivism and clicktivism. And so the idea behind these terms really is that by somebody sharing a news article or sharing a meme, they then feel that they have satisfied their political duty and they're done, right? And so there's a lot of criticism over it. I don't personally see it that way from the research that I've shown. What I see happening with social media is it's giving more of an outlet for these communities to form, right? Black Lives Matters, I think, has been a fantastic example of the way that something can start online as a trending hashtag and transition into what we've seen in 2020, which is worldwide protests, right? That they're not necessarily the same. They're not necessarily different, right? The hashtag is not preventing people from activating, being active in other ways. And from talking with people in the LGBTQ community specifically, there was a sense that they needed kind of that sense of security, of seeing support, seeing these, a movement that often gets criticized is when people put a little frame around their profile photo, right? Or for Pride, they put a Pride flag, Pride Month, right? They put a Pride flag over. And is often viewed as an empty, hollow gesture, which it is very easy to do, right?
Well, much of our conversation is empty, hollow gestures anyway, right? So it's not like we're only doing that on social media.
And talking with people, they kept expressing how important it was to them, right? Or how when they weren't out, seeing how many of their friends, right? Whether it was, when they blacked out their profile photos to show support for Black Lives Matter or put a pride flag on to show support. It gives people the courage to know that they have support and they can stand up, which I think is a fundamental basis for being able to elevate political action beyond social media. So I think it's giving groups a chance to kind of form security and know that they have support.
Okay, very good. That is all the time we have for our program. I want to thank Dr. Patrick Johnson for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.